School effects on socio-emotional development, school-based arrests, and educational attainment. This is joint work with Jeanette Porter, John Easton, Alyssa Blanchard, and Sebastian Kegel. I should just sort of mention this project is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we use data that comes out of the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. So by way of motivation, we sort of know there's a literature out there in psychology, sociology, and economics documenting that socio-emotional skills and mindsets are related to educational and adult outcomes. And by that, I'm really also talking about these non-cognitive skills. I've been sort of pushed off of that terminology because things that are cognitive are going on in the brain, and all these things are also going on in the brain. So I will call it socio-emotional development or social-emotional learning. We can have long conversations about that. So the things we're talking about are sort of adaptability, grit, motivation, empathy, conflict resolution, problem-solving skills, and teamwork. And as a result of this sort of research base, I think there are many schools out there that are now trying to incorporate socio-emotional development into their curriculum. They're trying to train teachers on these things. They're trying to measure these things with surveys for students, and they're trying to figure out how to incorporate this sort of insights about the importance of socio-emotional development to inform policy. But I would argue that the practice has kind of gone a little bit ahead of where the research base is on this, and we don't really have a good sense of whether this is going to be effective or not. And I think there are a few reasons for this. So the first is that we know, especially when we're using these self-reported measures, that they're going to be reporting biases. It's sort of well documented that if you're measuring, say, something like grit, where you ask a student, I'm a hard worker, they're much more likely to say they're a hard worker if they're around other people who don't work hard, because they're sort of answering in reference to some group of individuals around them. So if that's the case, when we see movement on these measures, we don't know whether we're seeing movement in the underlying skill or disposition, or if we're seeing movement in just the reference group. Another issue out there is whether these things are actually malleable over time. So psychologists, developmental psychologists will have a conversation about can we actually move some of these socio-emotional measures for students who are of like high school going age. And then the third thing to sort of think about is a lot of the research that's sort of documented that these socio-emotional measures predict long-term outcomes are correlational. We don't really know whether it's the case that if we were actually to shock or exogenously move these measures, if you'd actually see improved outcomes. So there's a lot of reasons to think that we don't really know whether these things are really going to measure anything meaningful that can be informative for policy. So in this work, we're really going to try and shed some light on the extent to which these things can be used, and we're probably going to raise more questions than we answer, but hopefully we're moving the ball forward on this conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use administrative data on 133 schools in Chicago. These are Chicago public schools between 2011 and 2017, and we're going to basically estimate school level value added on first-time ninth graders' hard and soft skills. So we're going to measure basically school value added on test scores, which is going to be a combined measure that's going to combine math scores and English scores on a ninth grade test. And we're going to combine that to be sort of like a test score index. And then the other and we're also going to use survey measures to measure school impacts on these socio-emotional measures. So the first measure is what we call social well-being. This is going to be basically a measure that's combining a whole bunch of questions that are asked about interpersonal skills. Those are things like, I tend to not get into conflict with students, or whenever there's a disagreement, I help resolve things. So there are a whole bunch of questions about that we call interpersonal skills. There are another set of questions about school connectedness that are about, I feel like I belong at this school, sort of it's related to the idea of belonging. We combine those two sets of questions and we turn that into a social well-being index. So that's going to be one of our key outcomes that we're going to look at. The other sort of dimension that we sort of categorize schools in terms of students' outcomes is going to be what we call hard work. This is going to combine basically a bunch of questions asking students about sort of grit. So I'm a hard worker, I persist towards my goals. Academic effort, I work hard, I do my homework every day, and then also academic engagement, which is, once I start something, I finish it. So all these questions are combined to basically provide a measure of the extent to which students work hard in school. So we're going to have basically these three indices, two of which are going to be socio-emotional in nature, and one of which is going to be essentially one of these sort of test-based measures. And we're going to estimate school impacts on those things, i.e. value added, and then we're going to basically ask the question, okay, once you've identified schools that tend to move the needle in terms of test scores or move the needle in terms of socio-emotional development, do these things persist over time? If I find a school improves socio-emotional development in 2009, are they likely to improve socio-emotional development in 2010? Are they persistent, or is it just sort of noise and reporting biases? And the other thing we want to basically explore is, once we identify the distribution of these school effects, we try to explore, well, what happens to a kid a ninth grader who attends a school that is much better in terms of test score value added, what happens to their high school completion, what happens to their college going, and we do the same thing for the social emotional measures. So once we identify school effects on these social emotional measures, what happens to a kid who attends a school that is very high compared to very low on socio emotional value added. And we're basically going to show you some evidence that schools do impact these measures, and they matter in terms of long-term outcomes, and in some dimensions they actually matter more than test score impacts. Okay, so the methods, and this is where all the violations occur. Okay, so we're going to use measures in ninth grade, and I could have just said these include test scores, social well-being, or hard work, but instead I had this really fun notation. So we're basically going to estimate the following model. So we have an equation over there, but I do have colors and arrows. So the outcome there basically describes the things we're trying to figure out. So the outcome is going to be a function of a whole bunch of things we can observe about the student. That's going to include lagged measures of the outcome, that is the outcome prior to entry into ninth grade. So that's going to be 8th grade test scores, 7th grade test scores, 8th grade measures of the same surveys, discipline, attendance, gender, ethnicity, free lunch status, in addition to the socioeconomic status of the census block that the student lives in. And then we're going to have basically school level averages of these same things. So these are all the controls that we use to try and purge our estimates from all the things that could potentially confound the effect of the school. And then what's left over is basically going to be a combined effect of the contribution of the school and some random error. So once we account for all the stuff that matters for child outcomes that we can observe, whatever's left over is going to be the effect of the school and other stuff that we haven't observed. So for every kid, we're going to basically take that residual, that sort of leftover piece, and we're going to say, okay, if a school is a really high value added school, that means that they're basically improving outcomes relative to what we'd expect on average for all kids in those schools, or for the average kid in those schools, more than the typical school. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to take the average residual, and we're going to for the school, and that's going to be our measure of how much that school tends to move kids on any particular measure above and beyond what one would expect based on observables, and that's going to be essentially the school's value added in a particular year. So So essentially, as long as the unobserved things about students are not correlated with the quality of the school, then these are going to be relatively unbiased estimates of the contribution of the school to these measures over time. And we have some tests about this, and if someone asks a question, I'll show them on the additional slides. So when we want to basically figure out whether attending a school that is high value added in terms of socio-emotional development or in terms of test scores, we want to figure out whether that matters for long run outcomes. It's really important that we don't use the same years of data for both things. Basically, you don't want to do that because, well, maybe you happen to be just a really lucky class, and that lucky class is going to do well in all dimensions. So what you want to really do is to say, what happens to a kid today who attends a school who in all previous years did really well at moving the needle on value added in terms of test scores or socio-emotional development, and that's what we're going to do. So we're going to basically use all the estimates from all the other years to inform how much we expect value added to improve outcomes this year. So we're going to test what happens to a kid who attends a school who attended a school that tends to raise value added in all other years than the year that they attended the school. And we call these things sort of leave year out predictors, and with that fun equation right over there. Okay, so then the second piece is, once we've identified these effects, once we've identified schools that tend to improve value added in test scores or improve value added on socio-emotional development, we essentially just run a regression and we control for all those same things we talked about before, and we say, does that improve children's outcomes in the short run and in the long run? And how much does it matter? How much does it differ between test score value added versus socio-emotional development value added? Okay, so here are some results. So here, this is looking at social well-being in ninth grade. So this is essentially testing the extent to which, if we estimate value added for a school on social value added, work hard value added, and test score value added in all other years, does attending that school in this year, does that sort of move the needle this year? So what this is showing you is that I'll sort of compare the outcomes between columns 1, 2, and 3. This is what happens if we could look at the social well-being measured in ninth grade. For students who attended a school with 1 standard deviation higher estimated social well-being value added. 1 standard deviation basically means going from a school at the average of the distribution to one at the 85th percentile of the distribution. So that's kind of the magnitude of the change we're talking about here. So going from a school at the average to one at the 85th percentile of the distribution in terms of raising social value added in all other years, that's basically associated with about a 9% increase in the 9% of a standard deviation increase in social well-being value added. And we do the same thing using hard work value added and also test score value added. And the thing that sort of jumps out at you is that the coefficient, the estimate, is much larger for social value added than all the other ones. So that's basically telling you that when we identify a school that raises social well-being value added, that's a much better predictor of social well-being value added in other years than all the other stuff. Now, that's not shocking, but it's basically evidence that to some extent we're measuring what we think we're measuring, and we're moving the needle in the dimensions we think we're moving the needle. So I can show you the same thing for work hard. Again, the effect for work hard is larger than for the other two. And then the last thing I'll look at is test scores. And again, so what's interesting about test scores, which differs for the others, is that for test scores, the estimate for test score value added on test scores is actually pretty similar to the effect of work hard value added on test scores. So this is basically telling you that knowing whether a school moves the needle in how students report working hard is about as informative about the effect of that school on test scores as measuring test score value added itself. This is kind of a remarkable finding. And in fact, if you look overall, the last thing I'll sort of point you to is these estimates down here, which is telling you how much of the variance of the school effect we can explain using only test score value added, that's the 0.004 versus the 0.007, sorry about that. Basically, we can explain about 40% more of the school effect on test scores using a combination of the socio-emotional development value added and test scores compared to using test scores alone, which is sort of remarkable. I think there's a sense out there that if you want to predict test scores, the best predictor of a school effect on test scores is test score value added. This is actually telling us something different. This is telling us that socio-emotional development may be foundational for success in school, such that knowing that a school is going to raise socio-emotional skills actually has quite a big effect on test scores, almost as important as a test score effect themselves. Okay, so now let's look at other outcomes that sort of might give us a sense of what's going on here. So this is now looking at course grades in 9th grade. The first thing, if you just sort of look across columns 1, 2, and 3, you see that the coefficient is much larger for the work hard value added. So work hard value added is a stronger predictor of course grades than social well-being value added or test score value added. If you look at absences, these are days absent. All of them predict having fewer absences, but we see that the strongest predictor of having fewer absences is social well-being value added, which is to say schools that are able to move the needle in terms of making sure students feel well adjusted in school are the schools that are reducing absences to a greater extent, and they're doing it much more so than test scores. And another thing I'll sort of point to, if you look at the predicted variance, you can explain about 3 times the variance of the school effects on absences using the socio-emotional measures versus using the test score value added alone. So there's a lot of information that is contained in these school impacts on socio-emotional development that we don't see in test scores. The other set of outcomes I'll look at are incidents and arrests, and we see the same basic pattern. We see big effects of social value added for the number of disciplinary arrests, and we also see that the socio-emotional measures are strong predictors, basically, of having a school-based arrest, much more so than test scores. Now I'm just going to fast forward to the final results. So these are now showing you just how much of the variance of the school effects on these longer run outcomes we can explain using test scores only, the socio-emotional development measures only, and then a combined measure that uses all of them. And what you basically see is that the gray bars basically tell you if you use test scores alone. The white bars are basically in the middle, are basically telling you what happens if you use a socio-emotional measures alone, and then the black bar is some combined thing. And you can see that it's always going up, which is basically saying the socio-emotional measures, school effects on socio-emotional development, predict more of the variance on things like graduating high school, enrolling in college, and enrolling in a four-year college. They explain more of the variance than school effects on test scores. And you can always explain more of the effect of a school by using a combined thing that combines the effect of school effects on both hard skills and on soft skills. And in most cases, if you do the calculation, you can basically about double the explained variance by using some combined thing versus using test scores alone. So there's a lot of information that I think is to be gained from getting these effects on these socio-emotional measures. So to conclude, we basically document that schools have real effects. They're persistent over time. They move the needle on exactly the kinds of things we'd expect. Schools that make students work harder improve things like grades, which are more consistent with that idea. Schools that sort of get students to feel more belonging, to feel more socially connected, basically get students to have fewer fewer days absent, which is kind of what you'd expect. And then the school impacts on both these socio-emotional measures are much better predictors of school effects on these long-run outcomes like high school completion, college going, than our effects on test scores. So I think the takeaway from that is that there is information that can be gleaned from these self-reported socio-emotional measures. I mean, obviously there are other things we could measure as well. But I think this suggests that it's going to be a fruitful way to move forward to try and figure out how we might better measure quality and how we might measure sort of use this information to inform policies that are going to improve outcomes for children in the long term. The last thing I'll just sort of say is there's a whole question of like, are these causal? I have a bunch of slides that basically say, look, if we look at kids who are from the same families, one kid went to a high value added school, one kid to the other value added school, we see the same basic patterns. And also if you look at enrollment patterns based on attendance zones, people who are zoned for better value added schools have better outcomes than students who are zoned for non-high value added schools. So there's a lot of evidence here that these things are causal.